Hello and welcome to Preemie Chats, a place for parents and healthcare professionals to gather, share stories, and learn from each other. I'm Jenna Morton. I'm one of three co-hosts who present this weekly series on behalf of the Canadian Premature Babies Foundation. I'm a career broadcast journalist and mom to three NICU grads, two of whom are preemies who were born at 32 weeks and are now 11 years old. And I'm coming to you from Mi'kma'ki outside of Moncton, New Brunswick. Preemie Chats is a creation of the Canadian Premature Babies Foundation. And the foundation is a parent-led charity that helps families during and after their NICU time through education, support, and advocacy. You can find information on our website. You can see it there on your screen, canadianpreemies.org. On the website, you will find links to our previous Preemie Chats, our podcast, all kinds of resources. Most importantly, you can connect with a community of parents and professionals who are working together to help our children thrive. Please take a moment to let us know where you're joining from, where you're watching from. This episode of Preemie Chats has been pre-recorded with our guest today, so we cannot have immediate answers to your questions, but please feel free to leave them in the comments and we'll do our best to come back and comment on those. I think it's fair to say that almost every parent wonders what the future holds for their child. And when that baby arrives early with health complications and ongoing challenges, you question how that might impact their life into adulthood. No one has a crystal ball that can give any of us an exact answer, but there are researchers working to try to understand how early preemie life might impact youth into adulthood, not just medically, but emotionally and socially. And one of the people leading that work is today's guest presenter, Professor Wolke. Professor Wolke is a professor at the University of Warwick's Department of Psychology and founder of the Lifespan Health and Wellbeing Research Group. His research focuses on development with a recent focus on what factors lead to social and emotional resiliency, particularly in preemies. He's the author of hundreds of peer-reviewed articles, multiple honorary doctorates, and recipient of the British Psychology Society's Distinguished Contribution to Developmental Psychology Award. Welcome to Preemie Chats.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction.
Well, thank you for joining us and for the work you're doing on behalf of all of us preemie parents who have these questions in our head that you're trying to find some answers for us.
I will try to answer them, and of course you're open to ask questions.
Wonderful. Well, I know you have a presentation to walk us through some of your research that we're going to share first, and then I'll come back with some questions. So I'll turn it over to you now, Professor.
Right. Do you put on the presentation? Yes. Thank you very much. Okay, my talk is on the long-term outcome after very preterm birth or very low birth weight birth. And I'm just trying to move on the slide, which didn't work, but I tried again. No, now it's working. Great. So every one of you knows that, or those who are listening to it and have got children who are born very preterm, is that the definition is of prematurity is a birth before 37 weeks gestation. And those who are very preterm born are usually born before 32 weeks gestation. Or other definitions say born very low birth weight, below 1,500 grams. Now, what it means if you're born that early, that the development of the organs is immature and being cared for outside, for example, being ventilated, needing temperature support like in the incubator, may lead to superimposed damage to the organs. So there are two mechanisms that may be proceeding. So what happens during these weeks that these children are born either extremely preterm or very preterm? So if you're extremely preterm born, you can see that the brain, for example, at 25, 26 weeks, just doesn't have any of the walnut pattern that we find at term. So there's a lot of development going on and cortical folding and building dendrites and building neurons to have connections within the brain. So the weight quadruples from 25 weeks to 40 weeks off the brain. So that's a lot of growth that's happening in the last trimester. So the question was now, like the new scientist asked, or nature asked, is the brain interrupted forever? And are you forever preterm? And this is the question we set out to answer. I know in the introduction was said I did this in recent years, but I follow up very preterm children now for nearly 40 years. So we have got quite a knowledge base. We have based first during childhood, adolescence, and now into adulthood. So my focus will be to look briefly at brain development, then at major functional outcomes like motor development, cognitive development, mental health, and personality. Then I want to turn to actual life tasks, because no one is evaluated by test scores, but what we do, whether we have got friendships, relationship to siblings and parents, form romantic relationships, become independent, earn our own money, and are independent from our parents. And then I want to turn what may be protective factors after discharge to make development better or more smooth, like resilience. So I will focus on data from a study where we brought together all cohorts around the world that have followed up European children and adults born preterm. And actually those who participated are people from New Zealand, from Australia, and from Europe. Secondly, I will focus on a study which we conducted with two colleagues, Neil Marlowe and Sam Johnson, looking at the Epicure study, children born before 26 weeks gestation. And we have got two different cohorts, one that were born in 95, and then with changes of neonatal care 2006. And a major part of my presentation is a study that's carried out in Germany. So if you see the map of Germany here, Bavaria is the largest state. And in the south of Bavaria, we recruited all children that needed admission to a children's hospital within the first 10 days. There were 16 children's hospitals. There were 70,600 births, and we had 7,505 children plus 916 controlled. And of these, born were 682 very preterm, very low birth weight, but about 180 of these died in the period till they would have been normally discharged. So we assess these children at birth, at 5 months, 20 months, 56 months, 6, 8 years, 12 and 13 years, 25, at 34 years, and we're currently conducting the follow-up at 38 years of age to get a full picture of the development into established adulthood. Let me now turn to the effects on brain development in adulthood. So we have published a number of data here with the colleague Christian Sorg, who is leading the module on brain imaging of these very preterm children in adulthood. And what are the major findings? Well, we show that there are characteristic changes in volume, in the limbic system, in the thalamus, in the cerebellum, and in the cortical folding all around here, and also in the network connections. So really the major changes are in the lower part of the brain, the parts that early develop, because it has got an influence how then the cortex develops. So we now know that there are changes in the brain, but are they related to functional changes, which we actually find? So very preterm or very low birth weight children have got a risk of cerebral palsy, which lies around 3 to 5 in 100 children. And in the extremely preterms, it's around 7 to 11%. But more children who are born very preterm or extremely preterm have got something which is called developmental coordination disorder, which means that they might have problems like being clumsy, tripping over things easily, etc., not having as good fine motor skills. And we still find that these problems persist into adulthood, in particular cerebral palsy, while developmental coordination disorder reduces somewhat. Let me now turn to cognitive outcomes. So in blue, we show in adulthood, and in red, or in this is orange type style, we show in childhood. And we find really large differences. So the average difference of a very preterm versus a control child is around 12 IQ points in childhood, and it still remains in adulthood. And here from the Epicure study of extremely preterm, we can see there's hardly any narrowing, not a significant narrowing of the gap between those who are born full term and the ones born extremely preterm. So these differences in IQ remain. Now it is very important that we follow up the children into adulthood because very often the children become a label that they're developmentally delayed. And that means if they're delayed, they should be able to catch up. But we can see that particularly the children who have got an IQ below 70 are less likely or very unlikely to catch up into adulthood. However, individually, there may be differences that there might be catch up or not, but as a group, they do not catch up by adulthood. So it's important for parents to know that there are differences in IQ that may remain. The second thing is this continuity in IQ we can also show in the brain. So part of this effect is mediated by us showing that there are alterations in volume and structure and in cortical activation in the brain that explain the continuity in IQ. Basically, what happens in IQ happens in the brain and not in the big toe, so it's related to brain activities. Let us now look at mental health, and we have different types of psychiatric problems. The one group is neurodevelopmental disorders. This is like, for example, autism spectrum disorder, or it is ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. But we also have got problems like internalizing problems, which is depression, anxiety, or externalizing problems, which is basically like conduct disorder in childhood or antisocial personality disorder in adulthood. And what we find is that there are clear differences in neurodevelopmental disorders, like in autism spectrum disorder. So very preterms more likely, up to 10 times more likely to have autism spectrum symptoms, and they're about 2 to 3 times more likely to have ADHD symptoms. And as I will show in the next slide, which is from the Bavarian longitudinal study, this is in childhood, this is in adulthood, we can see that there are more diagnoses of ADHD, but in particular of the attention or the combined time compared to controls. And both in the very preterm and in the full terms, there's a reduction of ADHD diagnosis into adulthood, but you can see still in adulthood, more than double as often, very preterms are affected. If we then look at mood and anxiety disorders, we actually find, at 6 years, at 8 years, very few differences, and still in adulthood for anxiety disorder. But we find an emerging difference of slightly more depression, major depression in adulthood for the very preterm. But the effect sizes are not large. They're much smaller than, for example, for IQ or motor development. Let us now look at personality. So we looked at mean differences, and this is an IPD analysis of 5 different cohorts around the world. So you can see the 0 line are the values for the control children, and this is the very preterm children, and we can see that they're much less likely or score lower on personality traits of extroversion. So they're more introverted, more withdrawn, less likely wanting to go out or meet other people. So they're more withdrawn. On the other hand, they're more neurotic. In particular, this means they're more worried about things in life, or get more easily out of sync if something difficult happens to them. They worry about it. They're more agreeable than full-terms one, do what they're being told, but they're also less open to new experiences. And that's often also related to be politically more conservative. So if I summarize this, the brain shows characteristic changes in the volume, limbic system, thalamus, cerebellum, cortical folding, and network connectivity in very preterm, very low birth weight compared to full term. They more often have severe motor problems which persist, but smaller motor problems persist less so. They have cognitive differences and these persist. They are on average about having IQ points 12 points lower than the full-term control group. They're more likely to be a little bit more anxious and depressed, but it reduces a bit. However, neurodevelopmental disorders like ADHD and autism are more frequent, and they still remain into adulthood, even though ADHD reduces, as it does in full term. And very preterms are more introverted, more neurotic, less open, but more agreeable. So these are results which we have from several studies into functioning into adulthood. But now the question is, what are the real life tasks that we have? Well, if we are born, or when we are born, we are usually born into a family. And that means we have to build relationships, like with our parents, but often we also have got siblings. As we wander outside the family, like in the nursery or school or on the playground, we build friendships with peers. And peers are very important because peers are our future, and we will have know people for a longer time, siblings or peers, than we will know our parents who will die at some stage. The next thing is in adolescence, sexual interest wakes up, and we're interested in romantic relationships. And most people want to have a romantic relationship with someone from the other or the same sex and to live together with them. And many also would like to have children. And important to be able to live apart from your parents is to be independent. So having employment and to move on. And all how well we do in these different life tasks is associated with how happy and how satisfied we are with our life. So here an example of Melanie, who allowed us to show her pictures. She was born, she's from the Bavarian longitudinal study. She was born at 26 weeks with 750 grams. Here in the hospital at 1 year, at 3 years at her birthday party. Here entering school in Bavaria, they get this filled with a tube filled with sweets when they go to school. And here she sent us a picture when she got married recently. So how often do very preterm, very low births which reach life goals? And here we're looking at wealth. That means, like, for example, higher education. Do they manage to get higher education, employment? Are they independent, not reliant on social benefits? And what we find here in the orange color is the very preterm. Let us center on this. We find they're less likely, 40% less likely to go to university, to reach higher education. They're more likely compared to full terms, which is the middle line here, to experience periods of, or they're more likely to experience periods of unemployment, so less likely to be employed. And they're much more likely, as a percentage, to receive social benefits when they are in adulthood. So let us look at peer and partner relationships, and here the sign again for the Bavarian longitudinal study. And let us look first at peer relationships. So in blue, the control group, and this is the mean across both groups, this line, and these are the very preterm. And what we find here at 26 years of age, and then assessed again at 34 years of age, what we find is that the very preterm is about half a standard deviation different in the quality of their peer relationships. And we can see that more of the very preterm are really doing more poorly in peer relationships. So there's a number of them who do quite well up here, but there's also a minority who do poorly. And when we now look at partner relationships, we also find that more of the very preterm have got problems in partner relationships. And I will show you next slide. What we found is that they've got more problems of finding a partner and building relationships or friends. But once they have found a partner, initiated a friendship, then the quality of the relationship is as good. So just to illustrate this, so we looked at 26 years at 34 years of age, and maybe I take the numbers at 34 years of age. So if we talk about delayed, they're not delayed. It's relatively persistent, this difference for a subgroup of very preterm children, is that still at 34 years of age, 15% of the very preterm had never dated, compared to 1 or 0.5% of the controls. 20.8% of the very preterm never had sexual intercourse, never experienced it by 34 years of age, but it was 0% in the terms. Everyone had experienced it. 21.6% still report they never had been in a serious relationship, compared to 1.5% of the term bond. So these are quite big differences. We then looked, bringing the studies together across Europe and in New Zealand and Australia, and we find that there are two major factors, after we have accounted for all of other factors, determine whether you find a partner. Those children, those who in childhood had neurosensory impairment, cerebral palsy, blind or severe hearing loss, or low cognitive abilities, are much less likely to find a partner in adulthood. And secondly, we found that males are less likely to find a partner than females. But now let us look at the relationship with the parents at 26 years and then at 34 years. And the interesting thing is, considering that in particular in the 1980s, the Bavarian babies were born in 85, 86, there was a lot of separation. They were often in different hospitals. There was not 24-hour visiting. It wasn't the parents who were caring for them, but they developed as good relationship with their parents as did the controls. In fact, they were slightly better, but not significantly better. What we found is basically full-term men have the worst relationships with their parents at 34 years of age. They are more often estranged from their parents than any other group. So the summary of results is very preterm, very low birth weight are less likely to experience sexual intercourse, and in particular, less likely to partner. Very preterm, very low birth weight do not catch up with their term-born compatriots by the mid-30s. Males are more disadvantaged in finding a romantic partner, and that's true for both full-term and very low birth weight. And when very preterm, very low birth weight partner, the quality is as good as full-terms. So we still will continue. We are just doing the follow-up at 38 years. And of course, we will report back once we have got the data. Now, the next question I want to turn to is really prematurity, fertility, and timing. So fecundity means the ability to produce offspring. And they're sort of contradictory results, but majorly they show that actually the ability to produce, I mean, having the organs for reproduction, they are perfectly functional for very preterm, but there's not enough research there, so we can't say this with certainty. The second question, of course, is, which is more certain one can answer, is have they produced an offspring? So we looked at the age as first reproductive event, a live child. So now I want to turn, how would we expect very preterms to do? Will they do worse? Will they do better? And there's a life history theory. And life history theory is a biological theory of evolution and evolutionary fitness. So it says populations follow an individual life history strategy in regard of the timing of event that make up an organism's life. So we're all born, we get weaned, we grow, we mature, we reproduce, and then finally we die. There are variations between organisms and also within populations, i.e. within humans, of how they do this sequence and how they do it. So an essential component of life history strategy is that there are trade-offs. Our energy resources are finite. So a major trade-off of, for example, dating, having children is somatic growth. So do we invest in our own somatic growth, which also means education, etc., or do we put our efforts in reproductive growth, like parenting, well, first mating and then parenting, which is really quite time consuming. And the predictions have been made, and it works for most animals, but we don't know whether it works for humans. And prematurity is how fast or slow individuals live depends on their own resources. It's usually determined by the size of birth, their own risk of mortality, and the risk is higher for very preterm, and on the predictability of the environment. So will you have the resources? So what we predicted from life history theory is that very preterm, very low birth weight as a population have less resources. So they show slower growth, they do slightly worse in cognition, etc. And therefore we think are less likely to reproduce across the lifespan. So very preterm, very low birth weight with high resources who grow well, have got a high parental investment, and find a partner are likely to reproduce as well as full terms. If very preterms reproduce, they do it more quickly because their mortality is higher and maybe their environment is less certain. And very preterms who reduce have a similar number of children. So we have looked at a meta-analysis again from this recap study, bringing together 7 cohorts who looked at offspring. These were the data available recently in 20 to 29-year-olds who had very preterm, very low birth weight. And here's the percentage of both sexes who had reproduced. These are the term-born, and these are the very preterm and very low birth weight. And this is for men, and this is for women. And we can see that for the very preterm, they are significantly, as we found, 1.3 times more likely to have reproduced in their 20s than the term-born in this meta-analysis, which we have conducted. So we now looked at the offspring in the German study, in the Bavarian longitudinal study, and we know that in Germany the average age of reproduction is 29. So anything before that is early, and after is later. And what we find up to 29 years of age, no differences in the reproduction of term-born and very preterm. The term-born are the solid line. But when we look after 29 years of age at a later time, we find that there clearly a lot more births for the term-born, so more than 60% had a child and about 37% of the very preterm. There's a real split in the strategy. So they are slower, the term-born, but they are more likely to have children. So very preterm, very low birth rate as a population are less likely to reproduce across life. If very preterm, very low birth weight have high resources, they are healthy, they've got a partner, they're less likely to reproduce as full terms. Thus, environments has important altering effects. If very preterm, very low birth weight reproduce relatively more than full terms do early, use a fast strategy, and very preterms who had children had as many as full term. I didn't show that. So very preterms, if they have high resources, produce as likely as full terms. So what is the problem of current research? So I've given you a lot of information. We start off with the exposure variable, which is basically we have got very preterms who have got an adversity and a negative experience early. We look at their outcome later on. And in between, at the moment, we have got a black box. We only look at the associations between the two, and we pretend nothing happens during life that may alter the life course of very preterm children. Is that really true? So what we have done, and I won a nice grant from the European Research Council for this, to invest in a team that we investigate protective factors across the life course, look what alternative developmental models might explain this, and I will give you a taster. What factors help for life course integration, like social integration, and we will also look at cross-general effects. So we have got the parents of preterms, we have got the preterms, and then the children of the preterms or the grandchildren of the parents. So what we did in the Bavarian longitudinal study, I joined it at the end of phase 1 with a new concept. That was at the time when I still had black hair and wasn't grey as I'm now, because follow-up is hard work and we age with it, with our participants. But what we did is different from most of the medical studies around the world. We actually focus very much on individual resources. We observed parent-child interaction. We looked at the quality of relationships in the family between the siblings, but also the partner relationships. We look at the quality of relations in the peer group and school, and we looked at the quality of the neighborhood. Were there playgrounds? Were they accessible places? Was it a good neighborhood to live in, etc.? So these were factors like we looked at, but I've explained them already. So let me just see how social factors make a big difference in the development of preterm, but also full-term children. So the first example I want to give you is socioeconomic status. Basically, it's your education of both of the parents, and it's the standing, the social position in the job. Like, are you from the top a manager, like from a CEO? Do you manage a small group? To managing just oneself, to being a worker with no responsibility for others, but given instructions of what to do. So if we look at high SES versus middle SES versus low SES, and this is the IQ of 100, that would be the mean we're showing here, you can see that those in the full-term group of high SES have got a higher IQ than those of low SES and middle SES. If we look at the very preterm, this is exactly the same. In fact, the difference in the same social group between full-term and preterm is around 12 to 13 IQ points. But the difference between being in the high SES and low SES is at this time at 6 years about 10 points. The same still remains at 26 years of age, but now the differences between higher social class and lower social class in the family of origin is about 12 IQ points. It's exactly the same as if I would deliver a baby, a full-term baby, 10 weeks earlier, very preterm. So the effect of SES and of being very preterm is about the same effect size. So it's a large effect and something which could be potentially altered. Now, we also looked across the whole country of Denmark, every birth in Denmark and every birth in Norway. And we look at parental education, lower, intermediate or higher. You can see it here. And the probability that they need help in the school, extra help, special needs education. And here's the effect of gestation. As you go to lower gestation, it's more likely, but you can also see these large social differences. And in Norway, it's exactly the same. So this is a very well replicated factor. However, so what it means is that social class, if I go back, has a main effect. So there's a main effect of gestation and of social class. So you end up worst if you are lower social class and you have lower gestation. So they add up. But now I want to show you a different developmental model, which we found from mother-child interaction. So we gave mothers and children this Etch-a-Sketch to draw this house. And you know, with this button, you draw vertical lines, and with this button, horizontal lines. And one button was given to the child, one to the mother. They had to draw this house. They could only do this if they worked together. And a mother could either do it by being very controlling, taking the button away, giving all the time instruction, or they discuss it and they work together. They're sensitive and they've got harmony. So there could be either a lot of conflict or not. So we looked at sensitivity. So low sensitivity, more control, less harmony, medium, and then high, where they really work together, laugh together. And for the term control children, when we looked at the outcome at 13 years of how well they did in school, we find that mother-child interaction had actually very little impact. So we call them the dandelions. You know, full-term children, you can basically, most of them, you can plant them anywhere and they will grow. But for the very preterm children, it's different, and we call them orchids. What happens is, if they have got low sensitivity by the mother, they do much worse than if there's medium sensitivity. And those who had highly sensitive parents, they did on average nearly as good as those who are term control born. So very preterm are much more vulnerable, but also more perceptive to good sensitive interaction. So let us now look, we had this comprehensive assessment in childhood, how it predicts health, wealth, and social relationships in adulthood. So we assessed disability, cerebral palsy, blindness, hearing loss, motor problems, or cognitive impairment. We looked at academic achievement and schooling, of how well they did in school. Then we looked at indicators of mental health, which we assessed at between 4 and 13 years of age. We looked at parenting, in particular at 6 and 8 years of age, and we looked at peer relationships in school. What we found is that very preterm birth is related to disability. That's not a surprise for you. It's related to academic achievement. It's also related to parenting. Very preterm is somewhat poor parenting at 6 years of age. And it is related to peer relationships. It only had a weak relationship to mental health, and I already showed this. This is overall mental health. But what we then found is we had thought that disability predicts most of the outcomes in adulthood, but it didn't once you control for all of these factors. What you find is that disability in childhood predicts your health in adulthood. And this may not be surprising because disability is part of health. But it doesn't predict the other factors. What really predicts how wealthy you are, whether you find a partner, and you have good peer relationship, is very much determined by academic achievement. Those children who did better at school, whether it's very preterm or full terms, were wealthier in adulthood. They're more likely to have found a partner, and they're more likely to have good peer relationships. Furthermore, we found parenting related to everything. In particular, it was related to health. The better the parenting, or more sensitive the parenting in childhood, the higher the health, higher the wealth, the better peer relationship they had with their parents still in adulthood. That's less surprising. But they're also more likely to find a partner, and they also have got more likely good peer relationships in adulthood. So let me now summarize the information I've given you. It was a lot. Many very preterm, very low birth weight develop better than expected. Environmental factors such as high SES, better mother-child interaction, so sensitive, stimulating, and academic achievement and academic support of the child promote health, social relationships, and integration and wealth in adulthood. Protective factors operate differently for different outcomes. Socioeconomic status operates as the main factor. It's sort of additive to the effect of very preterm, or it can compensate. While very preterms are more sensitive to parenting. So we have a moderation effect there. They're more like orchids compared to the more dandelion type full terms. Parenting and schooling and academic success have a large effect on life chances for all children, but particularly very preterm, very low birth rate. So what are the implications for services and follow-up? Well, it's absolutely clear from our follow-up that routine follow-up should not stop at 2 years or before school, but should continue into school age. Much of the differences for very preterm children is made by schooling. So it's an important effect, and it's made by parent-child interaction. So routine services should focus more on parent-child interaction and also assess much more social lives of children than just looking at motor and IQ. To support very preterm children, we need to mobilize promotive and protective factors, not just focus on what the child cannot do. And some of these protective factors are, for example, parenting. The transition into childhood, into school is very important. So we need a much closer liaison between medical and school services. Even though I didn't present it here, delayed school entry is really not advised apart for those who are summer born very preterm. But for the others, it's important that very preterms and full terms benefit better by being in school if the school is supportive. So the teachers perhaps should know about this and help them. So there are prem-aware schools now in Britain where training has been done of the teachers. And adult very preterm and very low births have special challenges in social relationships and in the workplace. So it's important to support them in their social relationships from early on. I would like to thank the research councils in Germany, UK, and Europe for the many millions of funding for our longitudinal study, my co-PIs, and over 100 researchers who contributed to data collection, analysis, and publication. It's hard to grow up. Thank you very much. I'm now open for questions.
Oh my goodness, so much just amazing information. Thank you for collating that and sharing it, because, you know, as a mother of 2 preemies who are just on the cusp, I think, of the group that you've been following, there's always been those thoughts of how will these experiences in childhood impact them as they grow up. And I'm sure a lot of people who are watching this are just, you know, filled with questions of their own that hopefully they'll reach out afterwards and share some. I'm wondering if you could talk just a little bit more. At the end there, you mentioned that you've been working with schools in the UK to be more aware of premature students and what their needs might be and how to help them. And I think that's a concept that's probably very, very deep at heart for a lot of parents. I know, you know, for us, we have, our children went to a fairly small school where we had the ability to go in and have a meeting with staff ahead of time. And they had several students before ours who had experiences. So we, I think, did benefit from the kind of sensitive environment you're talking about. But for those who are just about to head into school, what can you tell parents and educators and what's happening there?
Okay, it's actually quite complex because we tried to do a study, a randomized control trial of using delayed school entry versus, so let me start again. So we did a study, we had a whole project funded about, firstly, to find out whether delayed school entry makes a difference to very preterm. The problem was that these are observation studies. You know, in some countries, like in Germany, you're able to delay. It's not a problem. It's actually, they get a medical assessment together with the teachers. You can decide to keep them back for a year. Like in Britain, that wasn't possible. So we had a natural experiment who studied them in Germany and see what happens to the children. And actually the delay did make no advantage, but they were doing more poorly at 8 years of age, at the same age, than the ones who had not been delayed. And as COVID has shown us, which we propagated at that time, is very clear that presumably the worst is for those families who don't have the resources, who are poorer, who live not in that good conditions, themselves have not higher education, can't provide them with the same education. They do worse if they stay at home. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So actually it confounds the factor. If you delay and you don't have the resources, and you do more poorly. If you're committed and you're rich enough that you don't have to go to work yourself and you can do all of the education at home, it might help. But for most people, that's not an option. So actually delayed school entry is not that good. It's better to get in a school, but then of course you need the right support at school. So we wanted to do a randomized control trial. And first we had to ask parents, would they let their children to be randomized? And it was absolutely clear that a lot of the parents said it's such an important decision, not based on any empirical evidence, but on their emotions, that they said, I would never let my child being randomized to go to school now and thinks I want to make the decisions. So parents have got very clear pre-assumptions about it, which are often they want to protect their child and delay it. But actually, if they don't have the resources to do this, to do all of the things for the child, and they're not educators, as COVID showed us, it's the worst to be with parents. They can't give you the same education teachers can go. That's why teachers are a profession. They have learned something to do. Yeah. So it's important, but that's their idea. It's a sort of emotional. It's emotional. It's an attachment they have, or think that would be right. Okay, so we then looked at asked teachers about what they know about prematurity and the effects. They knew about cerebral palsy, and they knew about motor problems and potentially some cognitive problems, but they didn't know that they have more math problems, they're more likely to have ADHD, they have got more social problems. That was really poor. So on the basis of that, we reported this, and there are other studies which have been now done which show that teachers are not educated. But most of the teachers said that they would really want to know more about it, because they have seen that the population of those with special needs has changed over the last 20 years. In the old days, it was more Down syndrome, very clear congenital. Nowadays, they're more preterms. So they would like to know, but again, with parents, we asked them about would they want to know the teacher, tell the teacher, and 50% yes, said yes, and 50% no, because they might have wrong opinions about my child if they know it's preterm. So it's really up to the parents. Now I come, based on this research, a colleague of mine, Samantha Johnson, she is at Leicester University, developed a program, and some of the things I read through and did correction on social development, of working together with a charity, Tiny Babies, to accredit schools to be Prem aware. So the teachers take part in the training, and it's an online training. There's also a web page on this to learn about what you can do for preterm children. And so they're now Prem aware schools, and parents can choose them. And I think they're not that many yet. They're about 100 primary schools, but it's being rolled out. So there's a possibility to actually make teachers more aware. And I think the medical profession, researchers, teachers, and educational researchers need to work more closely together.
I can envision a future where you can see the strides that we've made in education now in understanding how different people learn differently, that in 5, 10, 15 years, it would just be part of education curriculum that teachers would have this type of awareness and training, and just enough of an awareness to know what to when they need more help. Right.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, for some people who are watching this presentation and listening to your research, might just be kind of taking the negatives that are in it and hearing a lot of they're not as likely, they're not as but there's a lot of hope in what your research is showing. So for us to wrap things up, I'd like you to just take a few moments to give a little bit more of that hopeful information from the actual data.
Yeah, so the statistics very often work in the way of saying you're more frequent, or this is the mean difference. So to give you an example, I mean, we talked about, for example, finding a romantic partner, yeah? And I take a number that whatever 22% have never found a romantic partner compared to whatever 1% of the control group. But it also means that 78% have found some, yeah? So it's actually the majority. And this is the case when I showed, that's why I showed some of the figures, is that you can see, but in the middle and further up, the groups are similar, but there's a longer tail end for the preterm. So there are more children who are not doing as well as the controls. And that is really a group. And if you, it's a larger group, yeah, but most of them do well, you know, in the normal range. And so we found, for example, because we followed them up on IQ, that by 2 years of age, we can identify those who will most likely, for cognition at least, stay in the lower end, that we can predict them. We can't predict it at 6 months, but by 2 years, we know quite well they're relatively stable. But if we take those children out who have got below 2 standard deviation or 30 IQ points lower, or developmental quotient points lower. If we then look at the group who are doing in the wider normal range, we can't predict how well they do. They can change. So most of the continuity is of those where you know by 2 to 3 years that they're doing poorly, at least in cognition or motor, while in social, things do change over life. It's more malleable. And I want to give a very important message, you know, because your parents sometimes write to me, and we had a conversation with someone, and she said, you described my child, you know, when we talked about children of things, and I said, yeah, he has got his 4th birthday, and he sits there by himself, he doesn't have a friend, and so on, and so on. And I said, well, when he now goes to school, one of the important things, you can do things. You can help, like, for example, to have a sleepover, to invite them to your house to play, and so on. And she wrote 2 years back, we have got 12 children playing with him. I've met the parents, and so on. So the important thing is not to say this is like it's going to be, is to try to help and facilitate, because as I said, preterms as a group are somewhat less likely to be extroverted, you know, outgoing and so on. Yeah, so it can actually help them, because once they've made the friendships, the quality is as good.
I think that is such a heartwarming thing for all of us to remember, because I think whether you're a preemie or not, that's an important reminder for all of us to put the time and effort in to creating those relationships, because that's where that quality of life is really going to come through for us. Yeah. Thank you so much for taking the time to share this with us. And I'm sure we'll be continuing to follow along as you continue to have these older and older cohorts for us to be able to learn
from. I don't know, I
from.
can go on forever, but the next period, 38, is definitely complete that.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you very much, Dana. Bye-bye.
My thanks again to Professor Wolke, who is a professor of psychology at the University of Warwick. He had joined me previously to record this portion of Preemie Chats. If you're interested in seeing some more of his research and following along with his work, you can find it on his website, which is on your screen there, dieterwolke.com. I'd like to remind you as well, you can find the replay of this on our website at canadianpreemies.org or on our social media channels. You can also find all of our previous Preemie Chat recordings there as well. Thank you for joining us and for engaging. I'd like to thank our sponsor for this series, AstraZeneca, for their ongoing support of Preemie Chats, as well as our partners at the Canadian Association of Neonatal Nurses and FICARE. And a reminder that Preemie Chats is here every Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. I hope you can join us next week. And until then, take care.